as we saw in the last tutorial, each society or culture is really made up of many different personal cultures that are reflecting values, individuals who differ from one another because of maybe religious or even regional or gender differences, or the places, the environments in which they work. And there are lots of other factors that contribute to changes in values. And so we're trying to come up with a meaningful way to look at the various factors that are common to the cultures in general, or that do represent, let's say, a particular culture. So in this tutorial then, we're going to try to identify some of those general categories that we can use to look at the commonly held cultural values and what we're going to call the cultural threads that do permeate the lives of each of the individuals within a culture. And then we'd like to describe several different cultures using the categories that we will be talking about. Now, over the years, there have been a number of anthropological models that have developed. There are some that literally have hundreds of separate cultural categories and frameworks that are very elaborate, that are intended to try to provide a description, or at least the conceptual slots for a description of a particular culture in great detail. And, it's very difficult we find it very difficult to fill out such an elaborate chart, because the challenge is that the information about people as they really live, their lives, as we'd say, in real time, in their particular cultural framework, with its set of categories and set of influences and directions and values, they don't necessarily lend themselves well to being isolated and dissected and recorded in those neatly labeled boxes or categories. And so that process of trying to categorize culture in such a way really misses something. There's a personal and a spontaneous and unique element to any cultural setting that doesn't manifest itself. It doesn't come through in those static descriptions and categorizations of objects and actions and systems and rituals that anthropologists have used. And so, culture study traditionally has seen culture in that very structurally functioning way, almost a scientific system in a sense, a categorization system, a taxonomy system that concentrates on social organization and let's say, and assumes that most likely in a secular anthropological system that there aren't in fact any moral absolutes, and there aren't cultural absolutes that would cover all cultures together. And so each culture in that system, or that way of thinking anthropologically, secularly, it's seen as an autonomous and static model that can be recorded, ethnographically captured, and then almost as a specimen can be studied in an objective manner that requires that researcher, that person who's studying the system, to remain, at least mentally himself, fully outside of the culture in order to bring his, let's say, in the system, objective frames of reference to bear. And somehow that provides an unbiased viewpoint for him or her. And, we can just imagine that, unfortunately and often, that leads to an unbalanced focus on the forms that are evident, the behavior of people, in other words. And to the detriment, really, of truly, from the inside out, understanding and considering the system of underlying meaning that's in place there. In other words, the identity and the worldview that's represented. Now, we've also seen and talked about the fact that and should be aware of for sure, the idea, at least, that culture and language are not easily separated from one another. That language is the verbal expression of a cultural worldview, a cultural system. And in that same way that culture and language can't be separated from one another, they also can't be separated from the real lives of people. There's no way to separate. There's no separate entity or body of information that is culture that exists in isolation from real people and real situations. It's impossible to study culture in an adequate way without coming to know and understand real living people, and also in moving toward, in the process of understanding them, and moving towards becoming a genuine part of their lives. That's what relationship building in true cultural understanding is actually about. Just as languages are always changing too, we keep in mind that culture is a dynamic and changing, developing world. And so, in order for us to adequately deal with the dynamism or the change, the interrelatedness of everything in a sociocultural setting, let's say, a language and culture, we're going to need to identify some important threads that allow us to construct a framework for being able to enter into the thinking of the people who live in that cultural setting. That we want to think about how people are expressing themselves and not only focus on the way they organize themselves, but rather on how that organization reflects the motivation that through which people express the meaning of their lives. And so, in the process of doing that, then we've come up with 4 primary areas that serve as reference points or places to identify an initial description of common cultural threads. These 4 areas are communication, life values, relationships, and identity. And that has been a way or a means for us of trying to begin to describe, as I've said, those common threads that are running through any culture, and that accomplish some of the purposes that we've described, that provide a framework for beginning to look into these areas of culture in more detail, to really begin to try to understand how culture is expressed, but not just expressed in form, expressed in motivation in the lives of real people in real situations. And so the descriptions under each of those 4 headings will provide some ideas of what we should be thinking about in that area. Now, they're not exhaustive lists, obviously, but they are some of the most prominent, or at least what come to mind as the most prevalent ways to begin to describe the threads in that particular area in any cultural setting. So let's begin to explore together these 4 areas that comprise what we're calling cultural threads. And again, our desire to capture, understand the real dynamic cultural situation based on relating to real people in the context where they live and breathe in real time. One of the first areas, as we think about communication, obviously should be language for us. And so even from the outset, we want to understand what are the major languages and varieties of languages used in a setting. It's going to be significant obviously for communication. What's the status of those languages? In other words, how are they viewed and valued in relationship to the other? How do we see the languages used in comparison one to the other? Many people in the world, as we know, are multilingual, And so we want to understand the language varieties, understand what language varieties they're using, so that area of language. And then also a second area in communication that becomes common because people communicate within and without, with others outside of their own group, is outside communication. What is the level or the status of communication from outside of that particular society? What forms, let's say, of media from other languages affect or impact, if that's a minority society, let's say, what are the access points for them? What kinds of visitors come and go in relationship to that particular societal setting? That's going to greatly influence what communication looks and sounds like, feels like in that social setting. So the languages and the kinds of communication that are occurring. And then also, we want to know, evaluate what are the literacy levels that are present in a society. What reading materials are actually available to people? Are there schools? Do people attend schools? Do children attend schools? What is the language that's used for literacy? Is literacy related to people learning to read and write? Is that related to their social status? Do parents prioritize that, and therefore their children are actively involved in learning to read and write in their own language? That becomes a very significant area of exploration for us in describing communication, in thinking about communication, understanding communication in real time in a social setting. And then, anytime even a secular anthropologist talks about verbal communication, in other words, language, we have to think also about both verbal and nonverbal communication. Do we see in a social setting, we see and hear words being spoken, but a lot of the communication taking place comes through nonverbals, the words, and as well as gestures, and gestures and words together used differently in different times and different situations. The eye contact that may or may not be present, the ways the face represents itself in the process of communication through eyebrows and tilting of the head, and the way hands are used to talk, for example, the postures that are expressed, the spatial distance between communicators, the time of communication, one person in relationship to the other, the pitch, tone of voice, all sorts of nonverbals that are a part of the way that we as human beings communicate meaning in a message. And so they become important. Nonverbals become an important way that we want to describe and think about communication as a very significant cultural thread for us. In relationship to communication, we also want to consider the spiritual aspect of communication. What are the avenues and methods, ways to communicate between people that have to do with the non-physical world? There are many times incantation languages, let's say, or prayer languages, or ways that people in other cultural contexts and in our own interact with spiritual beings, with people who may or may not be they may not perceive to be physically present. And so what kinds of communication do we see manifest in the area of spiritual life for a people group? And in this area of communication in relationship to cultural threads, we also to think about the different kinds of, let's say, levels, we may say registers of communication. There are in any given setting, there are formal ways to communicate, there are informal ways to communicate, what we think of maybe as slang and formalized speech. In any cultural context, as you grow to learn and understand more of that language in that society, you'll note that there are formal and informal ways of speaking. That there are formal and informal courtesies, ways of greeting and interacting with others. When a stranger comes into the community, how is that stranger conversed, talked with in contrast or comparison to people who are well known? When are the formal and informal types of speech used? Public and private, do they depend on relationship with a person? Do they depend on some kind of social status issue, right? And that leads us then to thinking about communication in relationship to age and gender and social status as we think about levels of communication. Do all people of all ages and genders and social status, are they all interacting with each other with the same level of inhibition, freedom? Or are there ways in which we see differences in that, what we'd call level or formality of language based on changes in age, gender, status, etc.? Is there, when we see a group and they're communicating, do we see everyone talking together? Or is there usually a spokesperson or some spokespeople who we could see representing certain social divisions or status positions? And then another important area in relationship to communication as one of our 4 cultural threads, as we think this through, is what does it mean to, in a setting, to effectively communicate, and what does it mean to ineffectively communicate? What are the facets, first of all, what are the facets or the aspects of effective communication? When do people listen, let's say, to a communicator? What motivates them? What do we see that motivates them to listen? Who do they listen to? Do they listen to everyone the same, with the same level of intention? When do they seem to understand? When do they seem to misunderstand what's being communicated? And how do they express that understanding or misunderstanding? How do we see that manifest in their language and their body language? What are the factors that we could identify that show that communication is occurring effectively and ineffectively? Do aspects of life such as respect, do we see that manifest in effective and ineffective communication? Do we see people empathizing? How do we see empathy manifest in communication? What's the value of honesty in the process of effective and ineffective communication? How do status and relationship play into how we perceive the effectiveness of the communication that's taking place? Now, I know that those are a lot of questions and categories, and you'll have access to a written version of that so that you can apply that as you think through these cultural threads that, again, as a reminder, we're trying to provide common categories that we all together can use to relate to real people and real situations in real time. And so that first important area for us of the cultural threads of this idea of communication. We know that much of life experience for any society, it has to do with communication. Now, communication doesn't exist in isolation. The communication reflects our second area here, which is the idea of life values, that people, as we've already seen and talked about, people are bringing life values to bear on the way that they function in relationship to each other, that there is a system of life values that's developed, and we want to explore that as we delve into language and cultural understanding and acquisition. One of the life values that we've alluded to is the value of harmony in a setting. That would be universally common to cultures around the world, that there are ways or systems in which harmony is provided for in a cultural context. And so as we're beginning to observe, and just to encourage you, as we move through these areas that you may feel inundated by the content, but in the process of explaining more of the language learning material itself, we'll provide you guideposts and steps and hand and footholds into this. So right now we're trying to give you an introduction to the bulk of the framework itself within which we'll be working for cultural information. So in thinking about harmony as one of the important values of life, what are the systems in place that do provide for harmony within a societal setting? Societal harmony, even economic harmony, sometimes or most times even political harmony. So broad group harmony. And how do the people there view a lack of harmony? Is there an expectation for harmony? What is the expectation? How is disharmony enforced? How is harmony recognized and appreciated? Are people allowed to bend the rules that are commonly held in the society? What do people expect of one another in terms of polite and impolite behavior together? Do you see manifest evidences of people being embarrassed by certain situations, and what kinds of things tend to embarrass people now? Keep in mind, in the early days, body language it's sometimes hard to read in relationship to that, but as you move forward, you'll be delving more into those areas. What is, in relationship to group harmony, what does conformity look like? What value do people place on obedience, let's say, on conforming and agreeing in relationship to what harmony is in that society? So the area of harmony as a life value, a significant life value. A second important value that we want to evaluate is the idea of authority. Who has authority in a group? Which people in the society are viewed to have authority? And that varies from society to society. And how do we see that authority expressed practically? Whether that's, and we'll observe that within different units, whether that's in a family unit, a clan, or a family line unit of some kind, and then in an entire community as a unit. How is that authority expressed? How is that authority gained? How do people even get a position in the first place? Maybe it's age, position, some kind of an inherited role from a relative. Those are all aspects that play into authority. And then also there's in the concept, within the conceptual frame of authority, there's power distance that is manifest. In other words, what areas do we see people manifesting that they have power over others? How do they gain that kind of power? How do they abdicate or give it up? How do they abdicate responsibility to others, delegate, in other words? And how are decisions made in light of that power distance from one person, one power group to another? How important are equality and class and rank, dominance of certain clans or groups in relationship to others? All of those kinds of components that play into power distance in relationship to authority within the context of life values. In every cultural setting, there are those who, as we think about the value of authority, we think about there are always the rebellious ones. There are those who don't conform well. So how is protest accomplished? How do people rebel, in a sense, against the authority structures in appropriate ways and in inappropriate ways? We'll see evidences of all of that. And that all having to do with the idea of the authority structures that are present in a society. So moving our way through some of these common life values in our second category here of cultural threads, the ways that we want to see culture, understand culture manifest in real time, in real situations. A third value that's important and will be important for us is the idea of responsibility. Both personal responsibility, how people personally take responsibility, but also in groups, how they take responsibility. In some cases, personal responsibility is more important. In others, group responsibility is more important. So what do we see manifest there? What are the tasks, let's say, or the obligations that an individual is expected to take up and to do independently as an individual? Then what responsibilities do people take up as a group? Both in relationship to one another as a group, or maybe as a group to outside groups, or even as a group or as individuals to spiritual concerns, to the spirit world. That there are responsibilities that different ones, different groups, subgroups even would feel toward spiritual elements or spiritual forces in their world. And then always we want to find out, what does it look like not to conform to the value that the society holds to collectively? In other words, what does it look like to be an irresponsible person in that setting? Are there those who we would be able to identify as we grow to know and understand in relationship people there? Are there those who we see, yes, that is an example in this societal setting of an irresponsible person because of the values that the group holds that we're growing to learn and understand? So that life value of responsibility it will be important for us in thinking through that cultural thread. And then another that we've already mentioned in our activity previously is people's view of time. Around the world, so many different ways to think about time and interact with time. Are people monochronic in the way they view time? Are they polychronic? In other words, is time a commodity, something to be cared for and watched out for, watched over? How do people think about misusing time as a limited commodity maybe, or not limited commodity? How do they manage time? How do they respond to attitudes that may have to do with wasting time, waiting, having to wait for others, moving quickly, or doing things quickly and efficiently versus doing them slowly and more nonchalantly with less intent of focus on time? Now, do people subdivide time in their society in the sense of separating out work time from, let's say, recreation time? So do they work in this kind of a way with this kind of a focus in time, or and then the leisure time is viewed much differently? Is that how it works, or is there sort of a blurring and combination of both? And each time I say one of these things, I think of even examples from my own experience that would relate differences in those areas, because all around the world people think of time so much differently than each other. That people measure time differently, which is another important subset of this. So that people in some settings, that their basic reference points are not to clocks per se, but rather to seasons, to moon movement, to harvest times, let's say. And then in some cases, there are artificial measurers of time, of course. So we wear watches to do that. And as I've said, lots of places they don't have access to that, so they find other ways to measure and monitor time. Another subset, what are the routines and habits that are established in relationship to time, in daily life of individuals, in family life, in group life, group routines and habits? To what degree does the group, or do the individuals in the group, those who have maybe the power, authority, how do they expect those routines of time and life to be followed? Who should do them? Who's not responsible? At what age are they responsible? What age are they not responsible? What are the rhythms or routine patterns of life that are manifest in relationship to time? And then again, the idea of time frames or seasons or eras of the life of a human being. There are so many differences in what's considered to be a normal time frame in relationship to the lifespan of a person. Even thinking about what a working week or day or season looks like. When and how long, and how do we prescribe the hard-working time versus time that's not so hard-working? In relationship to time, too, you think about ideas all over the board of past, present, and future orientations, people's relating to the linearity of time or to the cyclical nature of time. All of those representations of values and questions that we ask about value, life value in relationship to time, people's view of time. Now I hope at least you're getting the idea that these are deep and complicated areas that we need a means and a system for exploring and evaluating, and you can see the way that we're delving deeply, significantly deeply into the life experience of other people, that our inquisitive nature is what we're desiring to really understand how people work their way through relationships in life in the area of life values, which is a second area of cultural thread that we're discussing. Another important value for people in places around the world is the concept of privacy. Very, very differently interpreted and understood around the world. That in some cases, there's a very defined concept of aloneness, what it means to be alone. That people can and do isolate themselves in times of aloneness, and they have a desire to do that. In other cases, though, there's very little evidence of alone time or self-time, let's say, that the security is found in being together with a group. And so there, in that sense, we want to know what levels of privacy look like. Are there varieties of behavior that are manifest in different levels of privacy? What are the levels of privacy? Do we see many evidences of levels or difference in privacy in our societies? In the West, we tend to have a fairly strongly developed sense of privacy, but in many cultures that's not the case. How is space used in relationship to privacy? You think about the amount of space that we create for ourselves in our societies here, developed societies, and yet in many cultures the quantity and the quality of space is very different. We think about space that should include others into it, the personal space versus not personal space, and in some societies that looks quite different. And then another important value, the value of security. What does it mean to be afraid? How do people express their fears? How do they try to overcome fears? What makes them feel insecure? When people are sick or uncertain or experience loss or weak or in poverty, what is it that contributes to fear and insecurity? And we think about people's financial, social, or physical security. What do people see as the acceptable thresholds of security in their societies? What are the ways in which they gain security and safety? What are the sources of security? What's the knowledge and the status, even relationships, sometimes the government, sometimes the social organizations that help to provide or take away from security as a value? Another value, just mentioning these in introduction, is the idea of people's life priorities, their life value of priority. What are the life goals, the life priorities that people share with others and they're willing to openly talk about? When they think about success, how do they define it? What does appropriate achievement look like? Who in society is seen as a successful person, and why is that the case? How much do people value the same things? What are the things that they value? What does a comfortable life look like? What does an exciting life look like? What does a sense of accomplishment mean for people in that setting? What is a peaceful world in that setting? What is a beautiful world? What does equality mean? What does family security mean? Many, many ways we could talk about a sense of security in life, friendship and wisdom, and so many things that help to motivate and ascribe and provide value for people that do very much connect to their motivations as human beings. The motivating factors that we want to understand that are behind the behavior that we see. We want to know if people are motivated by prestige or comfort or financial improvement or learning and improving as individuals in a society. Are they motivated by being able to be independent or motivated by interdependence? Are they motivated by friendships? Motivated by being role models for others, perhaps? Someone that others can look up to, adventure and enjoyment, power and influence. All of those various nuances of human motivation that can affect the value of life in a society, which is all in the area we want to explore. And again, just to say that obviously we're dealing with complex and challenging level of understanding here. In any society, one of the values is what we think of as enculturation. And enculturation having to do with a number of subset areas, but one of which, for example, is respect. Who are the people that are respected in society, in a community? Who do other people listen to? What are the common topics for conversation? How do the respect and value get passed on effectively? Religious values, ethical values, how are they instilled in others? How are they strengthened? What are the methods for that? What are the appropriate relationship building skills that people are learning? How are their identities in relationship to this defined and described, communicated? Are they consciously communicated? Are they unconsciously communicated? In what ways? What's the priority for them in their society of passing values on? And lots of ways that we could think about that. The idea of passing on values. What are things are valuable? Values change. How are they changing in a society? What are the influences of change there? And then we also want to understand the origin point for values, what the foundation is for people's their ethics. How do they understand their origins and the relationship of their origins to their values? How does their view of nature, let's say the natural world around them, affect what they highly regard and how they behave towards that? Do they see history as we've mentioned, as an unending series of cycles, or is it linear? What effect does history and their view of history have on their values? How have specific actions in history affected what they hold in high esteem or even in low esteem in their lives? And of course, we'd have to think about, as we've talked about from James Sire and others, the nature as a value of human beings. What is people's understanding of the nature of human beings? And how does their understanding of the nature of humankind affect the things that they describe as values for them? So from our second cultural thread or major cultural area of life values, then we move on to the third of four, that of relationships. And again, just to reiterate, we're describing, I trust, a significantly, what I would think of as a qualitative investment of time in the lives of people. This isn't a process that we're going to quickly and easily accomplish in thinking about the multitude of questions that we're asking. In the area of relationships, again, we could go into great depth of discussing many sub-areas of importance for us as we think about, let's just say, personal interaction as one. How do people interact with each other? What are the levels? What's appropriate tactile interaction, touching? Who touches whom, how? What occasions? As people get together in social relationships, what does visiting look like? How do people interact, socialize? How do they talk? How do they gather? What is it that people spend time together doing? Who's included? Who's excluded? That relationship and social interaction takes place on the level of groups, and we'll see patterns of behavior in relationship to all kinds of groups and subgroups in the society. Also then, we'll see levels and kinds of relationships, group relationships that are individual to individual, group to group, all kinds of permutations of that. We'll see indicators that vary in different societies, cultural settings of relationship. They manifest themselves in different ways, different times, different situations. There are obligations associated. I think often about what gift exchange means and looks like culturally in different places. The formal language that's brought to bear on some of those situations. And then also, there's scope to relationships. How many relationships does a person have? With whom? What are the acceptable and unacceptable versions, etc.? There are lots and lots of questions we can ask and answer that you'll have access to. And also, people don't only relate inside their own group, they relate to others outside the group. There are patterns of behavior to outsiders and ways of viewing outsiders. The purpose and value of those relationships, the attitudes that are manifest, in some cases scorn or fear or suspicion even, acceptance sometimes, who is accepted, who's not. In any societal setting, another sub-area is how relationships are both formed and broken. There's a progression and a development in relationships that are formed. How do people form relationships? And then what are the obligations that are associated with that? What are the dependencies that are manifest in the relationships? In every setting, relationships break down. So why do they break down? What are the patterns of breakdown? What are the ideal patterns of relationship that people would suggest? And then what are the real situations that occur? Now, relationships don't just happen between human beings, one to another, but people relate to both the physical world and the spiritual world. And of course, we're interested in understanding the formal and informal aspects of relationship in religious identity for people. There are lots of varieties of relationship in religious belief. And we want to understand those attitudes and the beliefs about the spirit world. Are there people in the society who are specialists religiously? Almost always there are. We think of priests, pastors, shaman, perhaps, spirit people, healers, traditional healers at times. What are the attitudes that people have towards those persons? And do they fear them? Do they respect them? Do they show lack of respect? Maybe there's change in the society that points to lack of respect. So again, that's our third cultural area, maybe with less detail described right now, but again, you'll have access to those resources as you move forward in your learning. And then finally, number 4 here, our fourth cultural thread, that of identity. Identity, which is, we've already seen, connected to our stories, very significant. And there's individual identity, there's community identity. And so we want to understand aspects of both of those, the kinds of decisions that an individual can make on their own, not make, what are the group beliefs, how are the decisions impacted by the group versus the individual, are individual decisions encouraged? How do people see themselves in relationship to just the self, but in relationship to others? What's the self-concept? What does it mean to be self-respecting? How much personal freedom is attached to that? Significance. Do people manifest the need for an emotional security in relationship to themselves and to their group? You know, in a lot of societies, competition isn't what it is in the West. That there's more cooperative effort and less competition that's demonstrated. That people are more cooperative and less individualistic, but they may in that case be less cooperative maybe, or more individualistic. And so to be able to explore and identify that level of cooperation and in group action, the ways that they identify themselves together, are some criteria for evaluating that more important than others? What are they proud of? What's a scandal for them? What's a tragedy for the group, for those individuals? What do people complain about? What are people ashamed of in the society? Now, when we think about that kind of a group value, we have to also, in relationship to identity, we also think about the boundaries of identity. And that's important. It's going to be important in the future for the church that we trust that will be there. What are the in and out group boundaries? What's the perception? How are people in and how are people out? How are people accepted in from the outside? What place does the wider world have in relationship to the in-group? What's the position of the in-group in the broader society? How do people identify themselves as in-group members to outsiders? Are they defensive, or are they critical of the outsiders, or maybe they're complementary? Maybe they don't feel great tension. How are foreigners, people from other races and cultures, viewed in relationship to the in-group? Another important area in talking about identity, this thread of identity, this fourth thread for us, are the roles in society. Every society has identifying roles. And what are the expectations for community members in relationship to their roles? How does each subset of people play a part in that? How are roles originating? Are they just acquired at birth, like passed on? Are they tied to social status? Probably to some extent tied to gender. Good to explore that. Are they assigned by people in authority positions? Who assigns them? Are they defined even on the basis of personality traits, which is the case in a lot of settings? Or does a government actually, an outgroup actually impose them? Does a local structure impose them? Is there a school or a church even that has influence in those identity descriptions and discussions in relationship to roles? Inevitably, roles shift and change. How does that happen? What are the expectations for change in role? What are the attitudes and consequences that result as a result of role change? Well, I trust as we've talked our way in a blur, in a sense, through these four cultural threads, that you'll begin to feel the large and challenging task that's before us of understanding, creating a system, a manageable system by God's providence, that we can utilize in real time to relate to the lives through relationship in a cultural and language context, where we can begin to truly learn how to identify with people that we want to see reached with God's story and His message.